Have you ever imagined a winter so extreme it could literally freeze the air before it even left your lungs? Picture yourself as a Viking in medieval Scandinavia. Here, winter wasn't just chilly, it was a grueling 6-month ordeal, a period of relentless cold that most people today couldn't endure for even a single week. Many believe they grasped the severity of Viking winters, envisioning some snow, temperatures dipping below freezing, and Vikings gathering by fires sharing tales. However, the truth was far more terrifying than any cinematic portrayal. These weren't merely cold winters, they were apocalyptic, frozen landscapes that transformed everything into a deadly trap, where one misstep could mean never seeing spring again. In this video, I'll uncover the 7 most chilling realities of Viking winters that historians seldom discuss. We'll delve into how these legendary warriors survived temperatures that would prove fatal to modern humans within hours, why their food preservation techniques were quite literally a matter of survival, and the profound psychological impact that months of darkness had on entire communities. But first, let me offer some crucial background that will completely reshape your understanding of winter survival. I'm here to guide you on a journey back to an era when winter held a vastly different meaning than it does today. I've dedicated years to researching medieval climate data, archaeological findings, historical records, to reveal the authentic experience of Viking winters. What I uncovered was far grimmer than I ever anticipated. By the end of this video, we'll understand why these people were compelled to become some of the most resourceful and ruthless survivors in human history. Yet, before we plunge into the nightmare of a Viking winter, I need to share a fact that might astound you. The era we're discussing, roughly from 800 to 1200 CE, occurred during what climate scientists refer to as the medieval warm period. That's right, these were actually some of the warmest centuries in recent history. So, if you find Viking winters brutal during a warm spell, just wait until you hear what transpired when the climate began to cool. Most people assume that because Vikings were formidable warriors, they were inherently suited for cold weather. But here's the game changer. Vikings weren't superhuman. They were ordinary individuals, just like you and me, confronting environmental conditions that would challenge even our most advanced modern survival technology. Their only option was to adapt or perish, and the methods they developed were often born more of desperation than heroism. Let me paint a vivid picture of a typical Viking settlement as winter approached. Imagine a modest cluster of wooden longhouses, perhaps home to 50 to 100 people in total, situated on the edge of a fjord or nestled in a valley. These weren't the grand stone fortresses seen in movies. They were essentially large wooden sheds with earthen floors, minimal insulation, and leaky roofs. Now envision this entire area being buried under several feet of snow within mere weeks, with temperatures plummeting to levels that would make your modern thermostat seem utterly inadequate. The first crucial point about Viking winters is their extraordinary duration, far exceeding anything we experience today. We're not talking about a couple of cold months from December to February. A Viking winter could extend from October straight through April, with the most severe conditions persisting for 4 solid months, during which the sun might not even appear above the horizon for weeks at a time. The northernmost Viking settlements, they endured what's known as polar night, where the sun remains entirely absent for months. But the sheer length of winter was just the beginning of their struggles. The temperatures were beyond what most modern individuals can truly grasp. While we complain when it drops below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, Viking winters routinely saw temperatures plunge to -30, 40, or even -50 degrees Fahrenheit. At such extremes, exposed skin freezes in minutes, metal becomes brittle and shatters, and even breathing becomes painful as the moisture in your lungs begins to crystallize. Now, you might think surely they just stayed inside their warm homes until spring arrived, right? Well, this is where it gets truly fascinating. Viking longhouses were anything but warm. They were hazardous environments that demanded constant upkeep just to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. The central fire pit, which provided heat, also filled the house with smoke. Since proper chimneys hadn't been invented yet, Vikings faced a grim choice: freeze to death or slowly suffocate on toxic fumes. The smoke issue was so severe that Viking houses featured openings in the roof to allow smoke to escape, but this also let in snow, rain, and freezing air. Imagine attempting to sleep in a dwelling where smoke burns your eyes and lungs, as snow drifts through the roof onto your bed, and the indoor temperature barely rises above freezing. even with a fire burning continuously. This was their reality for months on end. Yet the true nightmare wasn't just the cold or the smoke. It was the profound isolation that winter imposed. Once the snow began to fall and the fjords froze over, Viking communities became completely cut off from the outside world. There were no roads to clear, no supply lines to maintain, and no way to seek help if something went wrong. Each settlement was entirely self-reliant, with only the food, fuel, and supplies they had managed to stockpile before winter's onset. This isolation created an intense pressure cooker effect that most people don't consider. Imagine being confined within a small, smoky, freezing building with the same 50 individuals for 6 straight months. There was no privacy, no escape, and no possibility of leaving, even as tensions mounted. Arguments that might typically dissipate in a day could escalate into deadly feuds when people were trapped together for months. The psychological strain was so intense that many Viking sagas describe winter as a period when madness and violence were rampant. The food situation was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. Vikings lacked refrigeration, canning, or any of the food preservation methods we take for granted today. They had to depend on smoking, salting, and drying to preserve enough sustenance to last through the winter. But here's the catch. These preservation methods weren't foolproof. If the weather was too humid, meat would spoil before it could be properly dried. If it was too dry, the food would become inedible. If raiders attacked and destroyed their food stores, or if they miscalculated their needs, entire communities could face starvation. Archaeological evidence indicates that many Viking settlements experienced what historians call the hunger gap, a period in late winter or early spring when the previous year's food supplies were critically low, but new food sources weren't yet available. During these times, Vikings were forced to consume items we would deem inedible today: tree bark, leather, and even the bones of animals they had already eaten. But even if they had enough food, the winter diet was monotonous and nutritionally deficient. For months, Vikings subsisted primarily on salted fish, dried meat, and whatever grains they could store. Fresh vegetables were impossible to preserve, leading to common occurrences of scurvy and other vitamin deficiency diseases. The lack of fresh food weakened their immune systems precisely when they needed them most, making them susceptible to illnesses that could rapidly spread through their crowded, poorly ventilated longhouses. The water situation was equally challenging. Rivers and wells would freeze solid, making access to fresh water impossible for months at a time. Vikings had to melt snow and ice for all their water needs, which consumed precious fuel also required for heat and cooking. This created a constant trade-off between staying warm and staying hydrated. Some settlements were compelled to ration water, drinking barely enough to survive in order to conserve fuel for heating. Now let's discuss their clothing and its inherent inadequacy. We often picture Vikings adorned in thick fur coats and warm boots. However, the reality was quite different. Most Vikings were farmers or craftsmen, not affluent warriors, and they couldn't afford elaborate winter gear. The average Viking wore layers of wool clothing which offered some insulation when dry, but became dangerously cold when wet. And in the humid, smoky environment of a longhouse, everything was perpetually damp. Their footwear was particularly problematic. Viking boots, made of leather, provided minimal insulation and became stiff and uncomfortable in extreme cold. Frostbite was common, and many Vikings suffered permanent damage to their feet and hands from repeated exposure to freezing temperatures. The archaeological record reveals skeletons with clear signs of frostbite damage, indicating this was a widespread issue. The psychological toll of these conditions cannot be overstated. Modern research on seasonal affective disorder highlights how devastating prolonged darkness can be for human mental health. Now, imagine experiencing this in an era before electric lights, when the only illumination came from flickering fires and oil lamps. The combination of darkness, cold, hunger, and isolation created a perfect storm for depression and anxiety. Viking sagas and historical accounts describe winter as a time when supernatural beliefs intensified. People reported seeing ghosts, spirits, and other supernatural phenomena during the darkest months. While we might dismiss these as folklore, they likely reflect the very real psychological stress Vikings endured during winter. Hallucinations, paranoia, and other mental health symptoms would have been common in communities suffering from malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and extreme stress. The social structure of Viking communities also shifted dramatically during winter. The usual activities of farming, trading, and raiding became impossible, so communities had to discover new ways to occupy their time and maintain social order. Storytelling became vital, not merely for entertainment, but for preserving essential cultural knowledge and fostering group cohesion. The long winter nights were when the great Viking sagas were recounted and retold, transmitting everything from navigation techniques to legal traditions. But these storytelling sessions weren't just pleasant gatherings around a fire. They were often the sole barrier between a community and complete social breakdown. In the cramped, stressful conditions of a winter longhouse, entertainment and social rituals became matters of survival. Communities unable to maintain morale and social order during the winter months often failed to see spring. The health challenges extended far beyond what we've already discussed. The combination of poor nutrition, crowded living conditions, and compromised immune systems made Viking communities vulnerable to epidemic diseases during winter. A single sick person could infect an entire settlement. And without medical knowledge or antibiotics, illnesses we consider minor today could decimate entire families. Childbirth during winter was particularly perilous. Women giving birth in the coldest months faced immense risks, not only from the birth itself, but from the challenge of keeping a newborn alive in such harsh conditions. Infant mortality rates were already high in Viking times, but winter births had an even lower survival rate. The decision of when to have children was literally a matter of life and death, with most families attempting to time births for the warmer months. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Viking winters was their unpredictability. While Vikings could prepare for a typical winter, they had no way to forecast when an unusually harsh winter would arrive. Climate records show that the medieval period experienced significant weather variability, with some winters being far more severe than others. A winter that was just 20% colder or longer than usual could mean the difference between survival and death for an entire community. Archaeological evidence shows us settlements that were simply abandoned during particularly harsh winters, their inhabitants either perishing or fleeing to other locations. These ghost towns, buried under centuries of soil and vegetation, narrate the story of communities that couldn't survive when winter exceeded their capacity to cope. The evidence from these failed settlements reveals something modern survival experts are only beginning to grasp. The margin for error in Viking winter survival was essentially non-existent. One broken storage container, one house fire, one key person falling ill at the wrong time, an entire community could spiral into a death trap from which there was no escape. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of Viking winter survival: the absolute reliance on community cooperation. In our modern world, we're accustomed to individual solutions to problems. Your heating breaks down, you call a repair service. You run out of food, you go to the store. But for Vikings, survival was entirely communal. Every person in the settlement had to contribute flawlessly to the collective survival effort, or everyone perished together. This created a social pressure almost impossible for us to comprehend today. Imagine knowing that if you made a mistake, fell ill, or couldn't pull your weight, you weren't just risking your own life, you were potentially dooming 50 other people, including children and elderly relatives. The psychological burden of this responsibility drove many Vikings to extreme measures we would consider barbaric today. Historical accounts describe instances where communities made the horrifying decision to abandon their weakest members when resources became critically low. Elderly people who couldn't contribute to winter survival were sometimes left outside to freeze, not out of cruelty, but because keeping them alive meant everyone else would starve. These weren't decisions made by monsters, but by desperate people facing impossible choices that no human being should ever have to make. The concept of individual rights or personal space simply didn't exist during Viking winters. Privacy was a luxury that could cost you your life. Every resource, every decision, every action had to be coordinated with the group's survival in mind. People slept in communal beds, not for warmth and companionship, but because individual sleeping arrangements would have squandered precious heat and space. Personal belongings were shared freely, because hoarding supplies could doom the entire community. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. The social hierarchy that existed during the warmer months often completely dissolved during winter. The chieftain, who commanded respect during raiding season, might find his authority challenged by whoever was most adept at managing winter survival. Women often gained power during winter because they typically oversaw food storage and distribution, making them literally the gatekeepers between life and death. Children were valued not for their potential, but for their immediate ability to contribute to survival tasks. This social upheaval generated internal conflicts that were just as perilous as the external threats of cold and starvation. Viking sagas are replete with stories about winter feuds that erupted when normal social structures crumbled under survival pressure. These weren't just disagreements. They were life-or-death struggles for resources and control that could tear apart communities that had coexisted peacefully for generations. The sleep patterns of Vikings during winter were entirely unlike anything we experience today. With only a few hours of dim daylight, Vikings couldn't maintain normal circadian rhythms. They developed what historians call segmented sleep, resting in multiple shorter periods throughout the day and night. Whenever fuel could be spared for heat and whenever their bodies could no longer function from exhaustion. This disrupted sleep schedule had devastating effects on their physical and mental health. Modern sleep research shows that irregular sleep patterns can cause everything from weakened immune systems to severe depression. For Vikings, already contending with malnutrition and extreme stress, these sleep disruptions compounded their health problems exponentially. Many historical accounts describe Vikings becoming increasingly irrational and violent as winter progressed, likely due in part to chronic sleep deprivation. The work required just to stay alive during winter was backbreaking and relentless. Vikings had to constantly tend their fires, meaning someone had to be awake and feeding the flames every few hours throughout the night. They regularly cleared snow from their roofs to prevent collapse, ventured outside in deadly conditions to gather whatever fuel they could find, and constantly repaired their shelters as the extreme weather damaged them. But perhaps the most exhausting task was the ceaseless battle against moisture and mold. The combination of cooking, breathing, and melting snow for water created immense humidity inside the longhouses. This moisture would freeze on the walls and ceiling, forming ice that would melt during the day and refreeze at night. The constant cycle of freezing and thawing caused structural damage that required continuous repair. The humidity created ideal conditions for mold and fungal growth that could contaminate their food supplies. The tools and weapons Vikings relied on became nearly useless in extreme cold. Metal tools would become brittle and break at the worst possible moments. Wooden handles would crack and split. Leather would freeze solid and become impossible to work with. Vikings had to constantly maintain and repair their essential tools. Yet, the materials needed for repairs were often unavailable during winter. A broken axe or knife could mean the difference between life and death, but fixing it might require resources they couldn't spare. The animals Vikings depended on for food, labor, and materials suffered just as much as the humans. Livestock had to be brought inside during the worst weather, meaning they shared the already cramped living space with cattle, pigs, and chickens. These animals produced waste that needed to be managed, consumed precious food resources, and exacerbated the humidity and air quality problems inside the longhouses. But losing livestock was often worse than the inconvenience of housing them. A cow or pig represented not just food, but also milk, leather, bone tools, and other essential materials that couldn't be replaced until spring. Vikings would go to extraordinary lengths to keep their animals alive, sometimes even sharing their own food with livestock when feed ran low. The death of a key animal could trigger a cascade of problems that would doom the entire community. The most terrifying aspect of Viking winter survival was the complete absence of backup plans. In our modern world, we have emergency services, hospitals, supply chains, and communication networks that can assist us when things go wrong. Vikings had none of these. Safety nets. When their primary survival strategy failed, there was no alternative. Communities facing a crisis during winter had to improvise solutions using whatever materials were at hand, and these desperate measures often led to their demise. Archaeological evidence reveals settlements where Vikings attempted increasingly desperate survival strategies, as their situations became hopeless. We find evidence of people burning furniture, tools, and even structural elements of their houses for fuel. We see signs that they consumed leather, bones, and anything else that might offer nutrition. Some sites even show evidence that communities resorted to cannibalism when all other food sources were exhausted. These archaeological discoveries unveil the final, most horrifying truth about Viking winters. They weren't just cold and difficult. They were elimination events that regularly wiped out entire communities. The Vikings we know from history and legend were the survivors, those who endured these impossible conditions. For every successful Viking settlement, there were likely dozens that simply vanished during particularly harsh winters, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and bones to tell their story. The psychological adaptation required to survive these conditions fundamentally altered how Vikings perceived life and death. They developed a fatalistic worldview that accepted death as a constant companion, not something that happened to others or in old age, but something that could claim anyone at any moment.
Peace.
This acceptance of mortality influenced everything from their religious beliefs to their approach to warfare and exploration. But this fatalism also imbued them with a kind of fearlessness that modern people struggle to comprehend. When you've survived multiple winters where death was a daily possibility, confronting enemy warriors in battle probably seemed almost routine by comparison. The legendary Viking courage we read about in sagas wasn't just cultural bravado. It was the practical outcome of living through experiences that would psychologically break most modern individuals. Children who survived Viking winters grew up with a completely different relationship to risk, hardship, and survival than anything we can imagine today. They learned from infancy that comfort and safety were fleeting luxuries, that survival demanded constant vigilance and preparation, and that the difference between life and death often hinged on split-second decisions and the flawless execution of survival skills. These children matured into the adults who would eventually usher in the Viking Age, exploring and conquering territories from Greenland to Constantinople. Their willingness to sail into uncharted waters, establish settlements in hostile environments, and take enormous risks in pursuit of resources and opportunities wasn't merely cultural ambition. It was the practical consequence of growing up in conditions where taking calculated risks was the only path to survival. The ripple effects of Viking winter survival extended far beyond individual communities. The constant threat of winter starvation compelled Vikings to develop increasingly sophisticated raiding and trading networks. They couldn't afford to be self-sufficient because self-sufficiency in such a harsh environment was impossible. They needed to acquire resources from other regions, which meant they had to become some of the most skilled navigators, traders, and warriors in the medieval world. This creates a fascinating paradox. The very conditions that made Viking settlements barely habitable also forced Vikings to become some of the most adventurous and capable people in human history. Their winter survival skills directly translated into the abilities that allowed them to establish settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even briefly in North America. The same resourcefulness that kept them alive through brutal winters also enabled them to adapt to entirely new environments thousands of miles from home. The navigation skills Vikings developed, partly out of winter necessity, became legendary. But what most people do and realize is that these skills were literally forged in the crucible of life or death decision-making. When your community's survival depended on knowing precisely when the last trading voyage of the season needed to depart before the fjords froze over, there were no second chances. Viking navigators had to interpret weather patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal changes with an accuracy that would impress modern meteorologists. Because a mistake in timing could mean being stranded away from home when winter arrived, or worse, being caught at sea when storms struck. The seasonal trading expeditions for which Vikings are renowned weren't just economic opportunities. They were desperate survival missions. Communities would dispatch their finest warriors and traders on voyages lasting months, knowing these men might not return, but also understanding that without the resources they brought back, everyone would perish during the winter. These weren't casual trading trips where you could come back empty-handed and try again next year. The pressure to succeed was absolute, which explains why Vikings were willing to traverse such enormous distances and undertake such incredible risks to acquire the goods they needed. But here is something that will completely alter your perspective on Viking exploration. Many of their most famous voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and North America weren't driven by wanderlust or adventure. They were essentially desperate attempts to escape the impossible survival conditions of Scandinavian winters. When your homeland regularly experiences winters that claim significant portions of the population, Suddenly sailing into unknown waters to establish new settlements doesn't seem nearly as irrational. It was a calculated risk where the potential rewards outweighed the certainty of eventual death if they remained. The settlement of Iceland around 870 CE is a perfect illustration of this winter-driven expansion. The people who undertook this journey weren't seeking adventure. They were fleeing a homeland where population growth had made winter survival increasingly difficult. Iceland offered the promise of new agricultural land, untapped resources, and, most importantly, the possibility of establishing communities that weren't already operating at the razor's edge of survival capacity. But what they discovered in Iceland were winters even more brutal than what they had left behind in Norway. The early Icelandic settlers faced winter conditions that make even the Scandinavian winters we've been discussing seem manageable. Iceland's volcanic activity created unpredictable weather patterns, with sudden temperature drops that could kill unprepared travelers in hours. The island's position in the North Atlantic meant that storms could arrive with little warning, bringing winds that could literally freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The settlers had to develop entirely new survival strategies, and many of the early settlements simply vanished, their inhabitants presumably dying during particularly harsh winters. What makes the Icelandic expansion even more remarkable is that these settlers were essentially conducting a massive survival experiment with no fallback plan. They couldn't simply return to Norway if things went awry because they had burned their bridges, selling everything they owned to finance the journey. They had to make Iceland work or die trying, and archaeological evidence shows us that many of them did exactly that: failed settlements. The Icelandic landscape, silent testaments to communities that couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive their first few winters. The successful Icelandic settlements developed winter survival strategies, even more extreme than anything we've discussed so far. They learned to utilize Iceland's geothermal features for heating, essentially building their communities around natural hot springs that could provide warmth even in the depths of winter. But this created a new set of problems, because these geothermal areas were limited and often located in places otherwise unsuitable for settlement. Vikings had to choose between access to natural heating and access to good farmland, fresh water, or defensive positions. The Icelandic Vikings also developed novel methods of food preservation that leveraged Iceland's unique climate. They learned to use the constant wind and cold to create natural refrigeration systems that could preserve food for longer periods, and traditional smoking or salting methods. But these techniques demanded perfect timing and precise environmental conditions. A shift in wind patterns or an unexpected warm spell could destroy months of carefully preserved food, leaving entire communities facing starvation. The psychological pressure of living in these experimental settlements was immense. Every decision about resource allocation, every choice about where to build or what to plant, every judgment about when to slaughter livestock or when to preserve food could determine whether the community survived its next winter. The margin for error was even smaller than it had been in Scandinavia, because they lacked generations of accumulated knowledge about local conditions to guide them. This constant pressure fostered a culture of innovation unlike anything else in the medieval world. Icelandic Vikings couldn't rely on traditional methods because they were operating in an environment where traditional methods often failed. They had to constantly experiment, adapt, and improvise. Developing new techniques for everything from house construction to food storage to animal husbandry, successful innovations spread rapidly through the small Icelandic population, while failures were quickly abandoned, often along with the communities that had attempted them. The social structures that emerged in these experimental settlements were also unique. The traditional Viking hierarchy based on military prowess and wealth became less important than practical survival skills. A person who could predict weather patterns, manage food stores efficiently, or develop new building techniques might gain more respect and influence than a traditional warrior. This created a more fluid social structure where innovation and practical intelligence were highly valued. But this constant innovation came at a terrible cost. The communities that succeeded in Iceland were the ones that could adapt quickly enough to survive their mistakes. Those that couldn't adapt fast enough simply vanished, taking their knowledge and innovations with them. This created a brutal evolutionary pressure where only the most adaptable and resourceful communities survived. But it also meant that much of the knowledge gained through experimentation was lost when communities failed. The religious and cultural implications of these extreme survival conditions were profound. Vikings had always believed in a cosmos where conflict and struggle were fundamental aspects of existence. But the experience of settling new territories in even harsher conditions reinforced these beliefs in ways that shaped their entire worldview. The concept of Ragnarok, the end of the world through a terrible winter, wasn't just mythology to people who had witnessed entire communities disappear during harsh winters. It was a very real possibility they lived with daily. The sagas and stories that emerged from these settlement experiences reflect this heightened awareness of mortality and the fragility of human civilization. The heroes of Icelandic literature aren't just brave warriors. They're individuals capable of making the impossible decisions required to keep communities alive through existential crises. These stories served as both entertainment and practical instruction, preserving knowledge about survival techniques while also providing psychological preparation for the extreme situations settlers might face. The expansion into Greenland around 985 CE represents perhaps the most extreme example of Viking winter survival challenges. Eric the Red, who led the Greenland settlement, wasn't just seeking new territory. He was essentially leading a group of people into what amounted to a frozen wilderness, where the margin for survival error was even smaller than it had been in Iceland. The name Greenland itself was possibly an early example of what we might call false advertising, designed to attract settlers to a place even more challenging than what they were leaving behind. The Greenland settlements pushed Viking winter survival techniques to their absolute limits. The growing season was so brief that traditional agriculture was barely feasible. The communities had to rely almost entirely on hunting, fishing, and trading with the Inuit populations who had already developed specialized techniques for surviving in Arctic conditions. But this created a dependency that made the settlements extremely vulnerable to any disruption in their food sources or trading relationships. Archaeological evidence from Greenland shows us settlements constantly on the brink of survival failure. We find evidence of people consuming increasingly marginal foods as conditions deteriorated, including seals, whales, and other marine animals that required specialized hunting techniques. The settlements had to develop new tools, new hunting methods, and new food preservation techniques just to survive their first few winters. But they also had to do all of this while maintaining the livestock and agricultural practices essential to their cultural identity as Vikings. The social pressure in these extreme settlements was unlike anything we've discussed so far. In Greenland, there wasn't just the pressure of community survival, it was also the pressure of maintaining contact with the outside world. The settlements were so isolated that they could only receive supplies and news from Europe once or twice a year during the brief summer months when navigation was possible. This meant that any crisis developing during winter couldn't be resolved until the following summer, if at all. The psychological toll of this isolation was enormous. People in the Greenland settlements lived with the constant awareness that help was literally months away, and that any mistake or misfortune could doom them before rescue was even possible. This created a kind of paranoia and hypervigilance evident in the archaeological record, where we see evidence of increasingly elaborate food storage systems, defensive preparations, and backup plans that suggest people were constantly bracing for the worst-case scenario. Climate data from the Greenland Ice Core tells us that these settlements were established during a relatively warm period, but they had to endure a gradual cooling trend that made conditions increasingly difficult over time. What had been challenging but manageable winters in the early years of settlement became increasingly impossible as the climate cooled. The settlements had to constantly adapt their survival strategies to cope with longer winters, shorter growing seasons, and more unpredictable weather patterns. The final collapse of the Greenland settlements around 1450 CE represents one of the most dramatic examples of winter survival failure in human history. These weren't primitive people lacking survival skills. They were the descendants of some of the most successful Arctic survivors in the world. They had developed sophisticated techniques for living in extreme conditions. They had centuries of accumulated knowledge about local conditions, and they had proven their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. But even with all these advantages, they ultimately couldn't survive the combination of climate change, resource depletion, and social isolation that characterized the later medieval period. The lessons from the Greenland collapse are sobering for anyone interested in extreme survival. These communities failed not because they lacked individual survival skills, because they couldn't maintain the complex social and economic systems that extreme survival demands. When the trading networks that brought them essential supplies from Europe became unreliable when the climate cooled beyond their ability to adapt, when their population dropped below the critical mass, needed to maintain specialized knowledge and skills, the entire system collapsed with shocking speed. Archaeological evidence suggests that the final years of the Greenland settlements were marked by increasingly desperate survival measures. We find evidence of people consuming their livestock, breeding stock, burning furniture and buildings for fuel, and abandoning the agricultural practices that had sustained them for centuries. The last inhabitants appear to have been trying to survive by hunting and gathering alone, essentially reverting to survival strategies that might have worked for small nomadic groups but could unsustain permanent settlements. But here's the most chilling aspect of the Greenland collapse. It happened gradually over several generations, meaning that people living through it probably didn't realize how dire their situation had become until it was too late to reverse course. Each winter was just a little bit harder than the last, each summer just a little bit shorter, each year just a little bit more difficult to get through. Communities adapted to each incremental change, but they couldn't adapt fast enough to survive the cumulative effect of all these changes together. This gradual collapse pattern appears to have been common in many Viking settlements that failed during winter crises. Archaeological evidence from failed settlements across Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland shows similar patterns of incremental adaptation, followed by sudden collapse. Communities would successfully adapt to increasingly difficult conditions for years or even decades, but then reach a tipping point where their survival systems could no longer cope with the accumulated stress. The implications of this pattern are terrifying when you truly consider them. It means that even successful Viking communities were constantly walking a tightrope between survival and extinction, and that the difference between a thriving settlement and a dead one could be as small as a single harsh winter or one key resource becoming unavailable. The Vikings who survived to become the legendary figures we know from history were the ones who managed to stay on the right side of this survival equation, but they were always just one mistake away from joining the anonymous communities that didn't make it. This brings us to perhaps the most important insight about Viking winter survival. It wasn't just about individual toughness or cultural resilience. It was about maintaining incredibly complex systems of resource management, social cooperation, and risk assessment that demanded flawless execution year after year. The Vikings who succeeded weren't necessarily stronger or braver than those who failed. They were the ones who managed to maintain these complex survival systems long enough to establish sustainable communities. The knowledge systems that successful Viking communities developed were incredibly sophisticated, encompassing everything from detailed weather prediction to complex resource allocation algorithms that would impress modern operations researchers. But this knowledge was entirely oral, passed down through generations of storytellers and preserved in the collective memory of communities. When communities failed, their knowledge died with them, meaning that each new settlement had to rediscover survival techniques that might have been perfected elsewhere but were lost when previous communities collapsed. This creates a fascinating paradox in Viking history. The very conditions that made their survival so impressive also made it extremely difficult to learn from their experiences. The communities that developed the most effective survival techniques were often the most isolated, and therefore least able to share their knowledge with other settlements. The techniques that worked in one location might not work in another, and the people who had perfected these techniques might not survive long enough to pass them on to the next generation. The archaeological record offers glimpses of this lost knowledge in the form of artifacts and settlement patterns that suggest sophisticated survival techniques. But we can only speculate about the specific methods that were used. We see evidence of food storage systems that could preserve supplies for years, heating systems that could warm large buildings efficiently, and construction techniques that could create structures capable of withstanding extreme weather. But the knowledge of how to build and maintain these systems perished with the communities that created them. This lost knowledge represents one of the great tragedies of Viking winter survival. How many communities might have survived if they had access to the techniques developed by previous settlements? How many innovations were lost when communities failed? How much more successful might Viking expansion have been if they had been able to systematically preserve and share survival knowledge across their scattered settlements? The answer to these questions is unknowable, but the implications are staggering. The Viking expansion we know from history represents just the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of human experimentation with extreme survival. For every successful settlement that left historical records, there were probably dozens of failed attempts that left only scattered artifacts and bones. The Vikings we celebrate in our histories and legends were the survivors of a massive, centuries-long experiment in human adaptability that claimed far more lives than it preserved. This perspective completely alters how we should view Viking achievements. Their success in exploration, trade, and warfare wasn't just the result of cultural values or superior technology. It was the product of a brutal selection process that eliminated anyone who could master the most demanding survival skills imaginable. The Vikings who survived to become legendary figures had been forged in conditions that would kill most modern people, and their achievements were built on the accumulated knowledge of countless communities that didn't survive to share their stories. Understanding this brutal selection process helps explain why Viking culture became so focused on concepts of honor, courage, and fate. These weren't just abstract philosophical ideas. They were practical psychological tools that helped people cope with the reality that death was always just one mistake away. When you lived through winters where entire families could perish from a single poor decision about food rationing, concepts like fate and honor become ways of making sense of a world where survival often seemed to depend more on luck than skill. The honor culture for which Vikings are famous was directly linked to their winter survival experiences. In a community where everyone's life depended on everyone else's competence and commitment, reputation literally became a matter of life and death. A person known to be unreliable, cowardly, or selfish wouldn't just be socially ostracized. They would be actively dangerous to community survival. The elaborate codes of honor that governed Viking society weren't just cultural traditions. They were survival mechanisms that helped communities identify and eliminate individuals who posed existential threats to the group. But this honor system also created its own problems during winter survival situations. The same cultural values that helped maintain community cohesion during good times could become deadly burdens when resources grew scarce. A warrior culturally obligated to uphold his honor might refuse to perform tasks he considered beneath his status. Even when those tasks were essential for survival, a family expected to be generous and hospitable might continue sharing their food stores even when doing so meant they wouldn't have enough for their own survival. The tension between cultural values and survival necessity created some of the most psychologically devastating aspects of Viking winter experiences. People were forced to choose between maintaining their cultural identity and staying alive, and these choices often had no good answers. Archaeological evidence shows us settlements where people appear to have died rather than violate cultural taboos about food, social hierarchy, or family obligations. These weren't deaths from ignorance or lack of survival skills. They were deaths from the impossible psychological pressure of trying to maintain human dignity in inhuman conditions. The gender dynamics of Viking winter survival were particularly complex and often completely different from what we observe in their summer activities. During the raiding and trading season, Viking society was heavily male-dominated, with men leading most economic and political activities. But during winter, when survival hinged on managing food stores, maintaining households, and caring for children and elderly family members, women often became the most powerful individuals in the community. This seasonal shift in power created unique social tensions not present in most other historical societies. Men accustomed to being leaders and decision-makers during the active season had to defer to women who possessed the knowledge and skills needed for winter survival. Women who might have had relatively little say in community decisions during the summer could find themselves making life or death choices for entire settlements during the winter months. These role reversals were necessary for survival, but they also generated psychological stress for people who constantly had to readjust their social expectations based on the season. Children in these communities experienced childhood in ways completely foreign to modern people. Viking children didn't have the luxury of a protected, innocent childhood where they could gradually learn about the world's dangers. They had to become contributing members of the survival effort from the moment they were old enough to perform simple tasks. A 5-year-old child might be responsible for maintaining the fire overnight, knowing that if they fell asleep and let the fire die, everyone in the house could freeze to death before morning. This early exposure to life-or-death responsibility created adults capable of making impossible decisions under extreme pressure. But it also created psychological trauma we can only imagine. Children who grew up in these conditions never had the chance to develop the kind of optimistic, trusting worldview we consider normal for healthy psychological development. They learned from infancy that the world was a dangerous place where mistakes had fatal consequences, and this knowledge shaped their entire approach to life. The educational system in Viking communities during winter was unlike anything we see in other historical societies. Children didn't learn abstract academic subjects, they learned practical skills that would keep them alive. But this education was incredibly sophisticated, encompassing everything from weather prediction to resource management to complex social negotiations. A Viking child who survived to adulthood had received an education in survival skills that would rival anything taught in modern military or wilderness survival programs. But this education came at a terrible cost. Children who could unmaster these skills quickly enough didn't get second chances. The community couldn't afford to support people who couldn't contribute to survival efforts, regardless of their age or circumstances. This created a brutal selection pressure where only the most capable and adaptable children survived to become adults. The Vikings we know from history were the products of this selection process, which explains their legendary competence, but also hints at the enormous human cost of their achievements. The religious and spiritual practices that sustained Viking communities during winter were far more complex and psychologically sophisticated than most people realize. The Norse mythology we know from later sources wasn't just entertainment or abstract theology, it was a practical psychological framework that helped people cope with the reality of living in conditions where death was a constant possibility. The stories about gods struggling against impossible odds, heroes facing certain doom with courage, and the ultimate fate of the world ending in winter weren't just myths. They were psychological preparation for the kinds of experiences Vikings faced every year. The concept of Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where warriors who died in battle would feast and fight for eternity, takes on completely different meaning when you understand the reality of Viking winter survival. For people who spent months every year wondering if they would live to see spring, the idea of an afterlife where the struggles of existence were transformed into eternal celebration was unjust comforting. It was psychologically essential. The promise that death in battle would lead to eternal feasting would have been particularly appealing to people who regularly faced the possibility of slow death from starvation or freezing. But the religious practices that actually sustained communities during winter were often quite different from the dramatic mythology we associate with Viking culture. The daily rituals, seasonal ceremonies, and community practices that helped people maintain psychological stability during the darkest months were often focused on more practical concerns, like ensuring community cooperation, maintaining hope during periods of despair, and creating social bonds that could withstand the enormous stress of survival situations. Archaeological evidence shows us that Viking communities developed increasingly elaborate ritual practices around food storage, distribution, and consumption during winter months. These weren't just practical activities, they were sacred ceremonies that helped maintain social cohesion and psychological stability. The act of rationing food, for example, wasn't just a practical necessity. It was a ritual that reinforced community bonds and shared responsibility. People who participated in these rituals were psychologically prepared to make the sacrifices necessary for group survival. The storytelling traditions we associate with Viking culture were also practical psychological tools for winter survival. The long, complex sagas recited during winter gatherings weren't just entertainment. They were ways of preserving essential knowledge, maintaining cultural identity, and providing psychological escape from the harsh realities of daily survival. But these stories also served as training exercises that helped people mentally rehearse the kinds of difficult decisions they might have to make in survival situations. The heroes of Viking sagas faced many of the same impossible choices that real people encountered during winter survival crises. They had to choose between loyalty to family and loyalty to community, between maintaining honor and staying alive, between preserving cultural values and adapting to new circumstances. By mentally rehearsing these dilemmas through storytelling, Viking communities were preparing themselves, psychologically, for the kinds of decisions that might mean the difference between survival and death. The medical knowledge Viking communities developed during their winter survival experiences was surprisingly sophisticated, but it was also closely guarded and difficult to preserve. Communities that developed effective treatments for cold-related injuries, nutritional deficiencies, and psychological disorders had significant survival advantages. But this knowledge was often lost when communities failed, or when the people who possessed it died before they could pass it on to others. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking communities developed medical treatments, remarkably effective given their limited resources. We find evidence of surgical procedures, herbal remedies, and psychological interventions that suggest a sophisticated understanding of human physiology and psychology. But we also find evidence of communities that lacked this knowledge and suffered devastating losses from medical problems that other settlements had learned to treat effectively. The inequality in medical knowledge between different communities created another layer of survival pressure that most people do consider. A settlement with access to effective medical treatments could survive health crises that would wipe out communities lacking this knowledge. But medical knowledge was often closely guarded within families or specialist groups, meaning it couldn't easily spread to other communities that might need it. The psychological techniques Viking communities developed for maintaining mental health during winter months were perhaps their most important and least understood survival innovations. Modern research on seasonal affective disorder, cabin fever, and isolation psychology offers some insight into the mental health challenges Vikings faced. But they had to devise solutions to these problems without any understanding of the underlying psychological mechanisms. Evidence suggests that successful Viking communities developed elaborate systems of social interaction, physical activity, mental stimulation that helped prevent the psychological breakdown that could destroy community cohesion during winter months. These systems included everything from organized games and competitions to structured work rotations that ensured everyone had meaningful tasks to perform. But these psychological interventions had to be carefully balanced against the practical demands of survival, meaning that communities had to develop a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, even though they lacked the scientific framework we use to understand these issues today. The impact of winter survival on Viking family structures was profound and often tragic. The nuclear family units we consider normal were often impossible to maintain during winter survival situations. Children might be separated from their parents and placed with families better equipped to care for them. Elderly family members might be abandoned or killed when resources became too scarce to support them. Marriage relationships might be dissolved or restructured based on survival needs rather than emotional bonds. These family disruptions created psychological trauma that affected entire communities for generations. Children separated from their parents during winter crises often struggled with attachment disorders and trust issues that made it difficult for them to form stable relationships as adults. Adults forced to abandon family members often suffered from guilt and depression that affected their ability to function effectively in survival situations. The social fabric of Viking communities was constantly being torn apart and rebuilt, based on the harsh realities of winter survival. But these family disruptions also created new forms of social organization that were remarkably resilient and adaptable. Viking communities developed complex systems of adoption, fostering, and extended family relationships that ensured children would be cared for, even if their biological parents died or became unable to provide for them. These systems were far more flexible and responsive than the rigid family structures that characterized many other medieval societies. The economic systems Viking communities developed during winter months were unlike anything else in the medieval world. The normal concepts of property ownership, trade, and economic exchange that governed summer activities often became completely irrelevant during winter survival situations. Food, fuel, and shelter were distributed based on survival needs rather than economic relationships. People who were wealthy during the summer might find themselves dependent on others during winter, while individuals with valuable winter survival skills might gain temporary economic power regardless of their usual social status. This seasonal economic disruption created unique forms of social mobility not present in most other historical societies. A person who developed valuable winter survival innovations could potentially improve their social and economic position dramatically, but they could also lose everything if their innovations failed, or if they made critical mistakes during survival situations. The economic inequality that characterized Viking society during the active season was often completely reversed during winter months, when survival skills became more valuable than traditional forms of wealth. Archaeological evidence shows us that some Viking communities developed sophisticated systems of resource banking and insurance that helped them manage the economic disruptions caused by their survival needs. These systems involved complex networks of mutual obligation and resource sharing that spread survival risks across multiple families and communities. But these systems also created new forms of social tension and conflict when people failed to meet their obligations, or when resources became too scarce to maintain the reciprocal relationships on which the systems depended. The technological innovations Viking communities developed during winter survival situations were often far more sophisticated than anything they used during their summer activities. The harsh conditions and limited resources of winter forced them to develop incredibly efficient and effective tools, building techniques, and resource management systems. But these innovations were often specific to particular locations and circumstances, meaning they couldn't easily be transferred to other communities or situations. The heating systems Vikings developed for their longhouses were remarkably sophisticated given their limited resources and materials. They learned to create complex air circulation systems that could distribute heat efficiently throughout large buildings, while minimizing fuel consumption and smoke production. They developed techniques for storing and managing heat that could keep buildings warm for hours after fires had died down. But these systems required constant maintenance and expert knowledge that was often lost when communities failed, or when key individuals died. Challenging. Winter survival knowledge wasn't just technical information. It was deeply embedded in cultural practices, social relationships, and psychological frameworks that helped people cope with extreme stress. A person might know all the technical details of how to manage food stores during a harsh winter, but without the psychological preparation and social support systems that made it possible to actually implement these techniques under pressure, the knowledge was essentially useless. The most devastating aspect of this knowledge loss was that it often happened gradually in ways that communities didn't recognize until it was too late. A settlement might successfully survive several winters using traditional techniques, but each year they might lose a small piece of their knowledge base. An elderly expert might die before fully training a replacement. A crucial technique might be simplified or modified in ways that reduced its effectiveness. A social practice that supported winter survival might be abandoned as communities adapted to changing circumstances. Over time, these small losses would accumulate until the community's survival capabilities were severely compromised. But because the degradation happened slowly, people often didn't realize how vulnerable they had become until they faced a winter that was just slightly more challenging than what they were prepared for. The final collapse, when it came, often appeared sudden and inexplicable to the people experiencing it, even though it was actually the result of years or decades of gradual knowledge erosion. The communities most successful at preserving winter survival knowledge were often the ones that developed redundant systems for knowledge storage and transfer. They might have multiple people learning the same critical skills. They might develop ways of documenting important information that didn't rely entirely on human memory. But these redundant systems required resources and social organization that many communities could unmaintain during the constant pressure of winter survival. The religious and cultural practices that supported knowledge preservation were equally important and equally vulnerable. The storytelling traditions that preserved technical information, the ritual practices that reinforced social cooperation, and the educational systems that trained new generations of survival experts all required stable communities with enough resources to support non-productive activities. During crisis periods, these knowledge preservation activities were often the first things to be abandoned, as communities focused all their energy on immediate survival needs. The loss of winter survival knowledge had cascading effects that extended far beyond individual communities. When settlements failed, they often took with them innovations and techniques that might have been crucial for other communities facing similar challenges. The knowledge of how to adapt survival techniques to specific environmental conditions, how to modify traditional practices for changing circumstances, and how to integrate different survival strategies into effective systems often died with the communities that had developed it. This knowledge loss also affected broader Viking expansion efforts. The settlements that served as stepping stones for further exploration and colonization were often the ones that had mastered the most advanced winter survival techniques. When these communities failed, they not only lost their own populations, they also eliminated the infrastructure and expertise that would have been needed to support continued expansion into new territories. The contraction of Viking settlement areas during the later medieval period was unjust due to climate change and political pressures. It was also the result of the gradual loss of the specialized knowledge that had made expansion possible in the first place. Archaeological evidence for this knowledge loss is both fascinating and heartbreaking. We find settlements where sophisticated survival technologies were built and then abandoned, suggesting that the knowledge of how to maintain them had been lost. We see evidence of communities that reverted to less effective survival techniques, indicating they had lost access to more advanced methods. We find sites where traditional Viking construction techniques were replaced with inferior methods that were more familiar to the builders but less effective for winter survival. Perhaps most poignantly, we find evidence of communities that appear to have been experimenting with survival techniques right up until the moment they collapsed. These sites show us people who were clearly trying to adapt and innovate, but who lacked the integrated knowledge systems that would have allowed them to succeed. They had pieces of the puzzle, but not enough pieces to create viable solutions to their survival challenges. The speed with which winter survival knowledge could be lost was terrifying. A community that had successfully survived dozens of winters could find itself completely unprepared. 4. Conditions that were only slightly more challenging than what they had previously experienced. The knowledge that had kept their ancestors alive for generations could disappear in a single winter. If key individuals died, or if social systems broke down under stress. This rapid knowledge loss helps explain why Viking expansion into new territories was so risky and why so many settlements failed. Each new settlement was essentially starting from scratch, trying to adapt existing survival techniques to new environmental conditions without the safety net of accumulated local knowledge. The communities that succeeded were often the ones that could maintain their knowledge systems long enough to develop local expertise. But the communities that failed often collapsed before they could complete this adaptation process. The social dynamics of knowledge loss were particularly complex during winter survival situations. The same conditions that made knowledge preservation critical also made it extremely difficult to maintain the social structures that knowledge preservation required. When communities were under extreme survival pressure, the normal processes of education, apprenticeship, and cultural transmission were often disrupted. People were too focused on immediate survival needs to invest time and energy in teaching others or preserving information for future use. The hierarchical nature of Viking society also contributed to knowledge loss in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The most critical winter survival knowledge was often concentrated among the most skilled and experienced community members, who were also the people most likely to be involved in dangerous activities like hunting, trading, or resource gathering. When these individuals died or became incapacitated, entire communities could lose access to essential survival information. The gender dynamics of knowledge preservation were equally complex. Women often possessed crucial knowledge about food preservation, household management, and childcare that was essential for winter survival. But this knowledge was sometimes devalued or marginalized in favor of more visible male activities like hunting or construction. When communities failed to properly integrate and preserve women's knowledge, they often lost critical survival capabilities without realizing it. Children in these communities faced particular challenges when it came to knowledge acquisition. The harsh conditions of winter survival meant that children often had to contribute to survival efforts from a very young age, but they also needed time and resources for education that communities couldn't always provide. The food preservation and storage techniques Vikings developed during winter survival situations were equally sophisticated and equally vulnerable to knowledge loss. They learned to create complex preservation systems that could keep food safe and nutritious for months or even years. They developed techniques for managing humidity, temperature, and air circulation that could prevent spoilage and contamination. But these techniques required precise timing, careful monitoring, and expert knowledge that was difficult to preserve and transfer. The construction techniques Vikings used for winter shelters were far more advanced than the simple wooden buildings most people associate with Viking architecture. They learned to create structures that could withstand extreme weather conditions while maintaining internal climate control and structural integrity. They developed techniques for insulation, weatherproofing, and structural reinforcement that were remarkably effective given their limited materials and tools. But perhaps the most impressive technological achievement of Viking winter survival was their development of complex systems integration that allowed all these individual innovations to work together effectively. A successful Viking winter settlement wasn't just a collection of individual survival techniques. It was an integrated system where heating, food, storage, construction, and social organization all worked together to create conditions where human life could be sustained through impossible environmental challenges. The failure of any single component in these integrated systems could trigger cascade failures that would destroy entire communities. A failed heating system could make food storage impossible, which could lead to nutritional problems that reduced people. The ability to perform the physical labor needed for construction and maintenance, which could cause further deterioration of survival infrastructure. These cascade effects could accelerate community collapse in ways that were difficult to predict or prevent. This systems integration approach to survival helps explain why Viking communities were so successful in some environments and so catastrophically unsuccessful in others. The techniques that worked perfectly in one location might be completely inappropriate for different environmental conditions. And communities that tried to apply successful techniques in inappropriate situations often failed spectacularly. The knowledge of how to adapt these integrated systems to new environments was perhaps the most valuable and most difficult to preserve aspect of Viking winter survival expertise. The communities that mastered this systems integration approach became the foundation for the most successful Viking settlements and the launching points for the most ambitious exploration and colonization efforts. But the communities that failed to develop these integrated approaches often left behind only scattered artifacts and mysterious ruins that hint at the enormous human cost of learning. 2. Survive in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The legacy of Viking winter survival extends far beyond the historical period when these communities existed. The techniques, social structures, psychological frameworks they developed influenced the development of cold weather survival strategies still used today. The integration of technology, social organization, and psychological preparation that characterized successful Viking winter communities became the foundation for many later developments in extreme environment survival. But perhaps the most important legacy of Viking winter survival is the demonstration that human beings are capable of adapting to environmental conditions that seem impossible to survive. The Vikings proved that with sufficient knowledge, social cooperation, and psychological preparation, humans can create sustainable communities, even in environments where individual survival seems impossible. Their achievements provide both inspiration and practical guidance for modern efforts to establish human settlements in extreme environments, from Arctic research stations to space colonies. The story of Viking winter survival is ultimately a narrative about the incredible resilience and adaptability of human beings when they are forced to confront existential challenges. It's a story about communities that faced impossible odds and found ways to not just survive, but to thrive and expand into new territories. But it's also a story about the enormous human cost of pushing the boundaries of what's possible and the countless communities and individuals who paid the ultimate price for the knowledge and achievements we celebrate today. The winter survival techniques Vikings developed weren't just impressive for their time. They were so advanced that some of them wouldn't be rediscovered by European civilization for centuries after the Viking Age ended. When the climate began cooling during the late medieval period, many of the communities that had replaced Viking settlements found themselves completely unprepared for conditions Vikings had routinely survived. The knowledge that had kept entire populations alive through impossible winters had been lost, and the consequences were devastating. This knowledge loss occurred because Viking winter survival expertise was incredibly specialized and difficult to preserve. Unlike agricultural techniques or basic crafts that could be easily taught and practiced, winter survival required the integration of dozens of different skills that all had to work together perfectly. An individual might master food preservation techniques, but lack the construction skills needed to build proper storage facilities. Someone else might understand heating systems, but not possess the social leadership skills needed to organize community survival efforts. The most successful Viking communities were the ones that managed to concentrate all these different types of expertise within a small group of people who could work together effectively. But this concentration of knowledge also made the communities extremely vulnerable to sudden losses of key individuals. The death of a master builder, an expert food manager, or a skilled weather predictor, could cripple a community's ability to survive the next winter. Archaeological evidence shows us settlements that appear to have been thriving one year and completely abandoned the next, suggesting that the loss of critical knowledge could trigger rapid community collapse. The social mechanisms Viking communities developed to preserve and transfer winter survival knowledge were remarkably sophisticated, but also extremely fragile. Knowledge was typically passed down through family lines, with each generation learning from their parents and grandparents. But this system only worked when families remained intact and when there was enough time for proper knowledge transfer. During particularly harsh winters or crisis situations, the normal knowledge transfer process could be disrupted, leaving entire communities without access to essential survival information. The apprenticeship systems Vikings used for specialized winter survival skills were even more vulnerable to disruption. A young person learning advanced heating system maintenance or complex food preservation techniques might need years of training before they could work independently. If their teacher died or became incapacitated before the training was complete, the knowledge could be lost forever. The archaeological record shows settlements where sophisticated survival technologies were abandoned mid-construction, suggesting that the people who knew how to complete them had died or disappeared. The psychological aspects of knowledge preservation were equally balanced between immediate survival needs and long-term knowledge preservation was constantly shifting. Communities that got this balance wrong often paid a terrible price. The psychological toll of knowledge loss was enormous for the individuals who experienced it. Imagine being responsible for your community's survival and gradually realizing that you no longer possessed the knowledge your ancestors had used to survive. Similar conditions, the guilt, fear, and desperation people must have felt as they watched their communities struggle with problems that previous generations had solved is almost impossible to comprehend. The documentation of this knowledge loss process is limited because the communities most affected by it were often the ones least able to preserve records of their experiences. The settlements that succeeded in maintaining their knowledge systems were more likely to produce the sagas, artifacts, and historical records used to understand Viking winter survival. The communities that failed often left behind only scattered archaeological evidence that hints at their struggles, but doesn't provide detailed information about what went wrong. Regional variations in knowledge loss patterns were significant and revealing. Communities in different geographic areas faced different survival challenges and developed different solutions, meaning that the loss of knowledge had different effects depending on local conditions. A technique crucial for survival in one area might be less important in another, meaning the same knowledge loss event could have dramatically different consequences for different communities. The timing of knowledge loss events was also critical. A community that lost key survival knowledge during a mild winter might have time to recover and develop alternative solutions before facing more challenging conditions. But a community that lost critical knowledge just before a harsh winter often had no opportunity to adapt and recover. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Viking settlements were eliminated by this kind of unfortunate timing, where knowledge loss coincided with environmental challenges that the communities were no longer equipped to handle. The interconnected nature of Viking survival knowledge meant that the loss of any single element could trigger cascading failures that affected multiple aspects of community survival. The loss of advanced heating techniques could make food storage more difficult, which could lead to nutritional problems that reduced people's ability to perform the physical labor needed for construction and maintenance, which could cause further deterioration of survival infrastructure. These cascade effects could accelerate community collapse in ways that were difficult to predict or prevent. The economic implications of knowledge loss were equally severe. Winter survival techniques often required significant investments of time, labor, and resources that had to be made during the warmer months. When communities were also trying to manage their normal economic activities, the loss of knowledge about how to make these investments efficiently could force communities to choose between immediate economic needs and long-term survival preparation. Communities that made the wrong choices often found themselves facing winter with inadequate preparation and no way to recover from their mistakes. The technological regression that accompanied knowledge loss was particularly visible in the archaeological record. We can see evidence of communities that abandoned sophisticated survival technologies in favor of simpler techniques that were easier to maintain but less effective for winter survival. This technological regression often preceded community collapse by several years, suggesting that people were aware of their deteriorating capabilities, but were unable to reverse the process. The social fragmentation that accompanied knowledge loss was equally destructive. As communities lost the ability to maintain their traditional survival systems, they often experienced increasing social conflict and decreased cooperation. The social bonds that had held communities together during previous survival crises began to break down, as people lost confidence in their collective ability to survive. This social fragmentation made it even more difficult to preserve and transfer the knowledge that remained, creating a vicious cycle that often ended in complete community collapse. The psychological effects of watching a community survival capabilities deteriorate were devastating for the individuals who experienced them. People who had grown up with confidence in their community, its ability to survive anything nature could throw at them, suddenly found themselves facing the possibility that their traditional ways of life were no longer viable. The anxiety, depression, and despair that accompanied this realization often made it even more difficult for communities to organize effective responses to their survival challenges. The loss of winter survival knowledge also had profound effects on Viking culture and identity. The ability to survive impossible winters had been central to Viking self-conception and cultural pride. Communities that lost this capability often experienced a crisis of cultural identity that was just as devastating as the practical survival challenges they faced. The stories, rituals, and social practices that had supported winter survival were often abandoned along with the technical knowledge, leaving communities without the cultural framework they needed to maintain social cohesion during crisis periods. The speed with which cultural knowledge could disappear was remarkable and terrifying. Practices that had been central to community life for generations could be forgotten in a single winter, if the people who maintained them died, or if social structures broke down under stress. The oral traditions that preserved technical information, the ritual practices that reinforced social cooperation, and the educational systems that trained new generations could all disappear with shocking rapidity. When communities were under extreme pressure, archaeological evidence shows us that many Viking communities made desperate attempts to preserve their knowledge even as they were collapsing. We find evidence of communities that tried to document their survival techniques in physical artifacts that attempted to simplify complex knowledge systems to make them easier to preserve, and that made extraordinary efforts to maintain their cultural practices even when they lacked the resources to do so effectively. These efforts rarely succeeded, but they provide moving testimony to the value these communities placed on preserving their survival heritage. Regional variations in knowledge loss patterns were significant and revealing. Communities in different geographic areas faced different survival challenges and developed different solutions, meaning that the loss of knowledge had different effects depending on local conditions. A technique crucial for survival in one area might be less important in another, meaning the same knowledge loss event could have dramatically different consequences for different communities. The timing of knowledge loss events was also critical. A community that lost key survival knowledge just during a mild winter might have time to recover and develop alternative solutions before facing more challenging conditions. But a community that lost critical knowledge just before a harsh winter often had no opportunity to adapt and recover. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Viking settlements were eliminated by this kind of unfortunate timing. Knowledge loss coincided with environmental challenges that the communities were no longer equipped to handle. The interconnected nature of Viking survival knowledge meant that the loss of any single element could trigger cascading failures that affected multiple aspects of community survival. The loss of advanced heating techniques could make food storage more difficult, which could lead to nutritional problems that reduced people's ability to perform the physical labor needed for construction and maintenance, which could cause further deterioration of survival infrastructure. These cascade effects could accelerate community collapse in ways that were difficult to predict or prevent. The economic implications of knowledge loss were equally severe. Winter survival techniques often required significant investments of time, labor, and resources that had to be made during the warmer months. When communities were also trying to manage their normal economic activities, the loss of knowledge about how to make these investments efficiently could force communities to choose between immediate economic needs and long-term survival preparation. Communities that made the wrong choices often found themselves facing winter with inadequate preparation and no way to recover from their mistakes. The technological regression that accompanied knowledge loss was particularly visible in the archaeological record. We can see evidence of communities that abandoned sophisticated survival technologies in favor of simpler techniques that were easier to maintain but less effective for winter survival. This technological regression often preceded community collapse by several years, suggesting that people were aware of their deteriorating capabilities, but were unable to reverse the process. The social fragmentation that accompanied knowledge loss was equally destructive. As communities lost the ability to maintain their traditional survival systems, they often experienced increasing social conflict and decreased cooperation. The social bonds that had held communities together during previous survival crises began to break down, as people lost confidence in their collective ability to survive. This social fragmentation made it even more difficult to preserve and transfer the knowledge that remained, creating a vicious cycle that often ended in complete community collapse. The psychological effects of watching a community survival capabilities deteriorate were devastating for the individuals who experienced them. People who had grown up with confidence in their community, its ability to survive anything nature could throw at them, suddenly found themselves facing the possibility that their traditional ways of life were no longer viable. The anxiety, depression, and despair that accompanied this realization often made it even more difficult for communities to organize effective responses to their survival challenges. The loss of winter survival knowledge also had profound effects on Viking culture and identity. The ability to survive impossible winters had been central to Viking self-conception and cultural pride. Communities that lost this capability often experienced a crisis of cultural identity that was just as devastating as the practical survival challenges they faced. The stories, rituals, and social practices that had supported winter survival were often abandoned along with the technical knowledge, leaving communities without the cultural framework they needed to maintain social cohesion during crisis periods. The speed with which cultural knowledge could disappear was remarkable and terrifying. Practices that had been central to community life for generations could be forgotten in a single winter, if the people who maintained them died, or if social structures broke down under stress. The oral traditions that preserved technical information, the ritual practices that reinforced social cooperation, and the educational systems that trained new generations could all disappear with shocking rapidity. When communities were under extreme pressure, archaeological evidence shows us that many Viking communities made desperate attempts to preserve their knowledge even as they were collapsing. We find evidence of communities that tried to document their survival techniques in physical artifacts that attempted to simplify complex knowledge systems to make them easier to preserve, and that made extraordinary efforts to maintain their cultural practices even when they lacked the resources to do so effectively. These efforts rarely succeeded, but they provide moving testimony to the value these communities placed on preserving their survival heritage. The regional networks that had supported knowledge sharing between Viking communities also began to break down as individual settlements failed. The trading relationships, kinship connections, and cultural exchanges that had allowed successful survival techniques to spread from one community to another were disrupted when key settlements collapsed. This network fragmentation meant that communities that might have been able to survive with outside knowledge and support found themselves isolated and unable to access the resources they needed. The climate changes that occurred during the later medieval period accelerated knowledge loss by making traditional survival techniques less effective. Communities that had developed their winter survival systems during warmer periods found that their techniques were inadequate for the colder conditions that began to prevail. After 1300 CE, the knowledge that had kept them alive for generations was suddenly insufficient. But they lacked the time and resources needed to develop new techniques that could handle the changing conditions. The political changes that accompanied the end of the Viking Age also contributed to knowledge loss. The centralized kingdoms that replaced Viking communities often had different priorities and different approaches to resource management that didn't support the maintenance of traditional winter survival knowledge. The local autonomy that had allowed Viking communities to develop specialized survival techniques was gradually eliminated, as larger political entities imposed standardized approaches that were less adapted to local conditions. The religious changes that occurred during the Christianization of Scandinavia also affected knowledge preservation. The storytelling traditions, Ritual practices and cultural frameworks that had supported winter survival knowledge were often associated with pagan beliefs that were actively suppressed by Christian authorities. The loss of these cultural support systems made it much more difficult to preserve and transfer the technical knowledge that they had maintained. The economic changes that accompanied the transition from the Viking Age to the later medieval period also reduced communities' ability to maintain winter survival knowledge. The focus on monetary exchange and market-based resource allocation that characterized the later medieval economy was often incompatible with the resource sharing and community cooperation that Viking winter survival required. Communities that adopted these new economic systems often found that they had lost the social mechanisms that had supported their survival capabilities. The educational changes that occurred during this transition period were equally significant. The formal educational systems that began to develop during the later medieval period were focused on literacy, religious instruction, and administrative skills that were valuable for the emerging political and economic systems. But these educational systems didn't preserve the practical survival knowledge that had been central to Viking culture. The apprenticeship systems and informal knowledge transfer mechanisms that had maintained winter survival expertise were gradually replaced by educational approaches that didn't support these capabilities. The urbanization that began during the later medieval period also contributed to knowledge loss. As people moved from rural settlements to towns and cities, they lost direct contact with the environmental conditions that had shaped Viking winter survival techniques. The knowledge that had been essential for survival in rural settlements became irrelevant for urban populations. And the social structures that had supported knowledge preservation in small communities were difficult to maintain in larger urban environments. The technological changes that occurred during this period created both opportunities and challenges for knowledge preservation. The development of writing systems made it theoretically possible to document survival techniques in ways that had been impossible during the earlier Viking period. But the people who possessed this knowledge were often illiterate. The people who could write often lacked the practical experience needed to accurately document survival techniques. The few attempts to preserve winter survival knowledge in written form were often incomplete or inaccurate, and they couldn't capture the social and psychological aspects of survival that were crucial for successful implementation. The military changes that occurred during the transition from the Viking Age to the later medieval period also affected knowledge preservation. The professional military systems that replaced Viking warrior bands had different training requirements and different approaches to resource management. The survival skills that had been essential for Viking warriors were often irrelevant for medieval soldiers. And the social structures that had supported these capabilities were gradually eliminated as military organization became more centralized and specialized. The demographic changes that occurred during this period were equally significant. The population growth that characterized much of the later medieval period created new pressures on resources and new approaches to community organization that were often incompatible with traditional Viking survival techniques. The smaller, more autonomous communities that had developed and maintained winter survival knowledge were gradually absorbed into larger political and economic systems that had different priorities and different approaches to resource management. The environmental changes that occurred during this period created new challenges that traditional survival techniques weren't designed to handle. The deforestation that accompanied population growth reduced the availability of fuel and building materials essential for winter survival. The soil depletion that resulted from intensive agriculture reduced the productivity of food systems that communities depended on for winter survival. The climate changes that began during the later medieval period created new weather patterns that traditional survival techniques weren't designed to handle. The trade changes that occurred during this period also affected knowledge preservation. The long-distance trading networks that had supported Viking expansion and colonization were gradually replaced by different commercial systems that had different requirements and different approaches to resource management. The knowledge that had been essential for managing resources in isolated settlements became less relevant as communities became more integrated into larger economic systems. The legal changes that occurred during the transition from the Viking Age to the later medieval period also contributed to knowledge loss. The customary legal systems that had supported Viking communities were gradually replaced by written legal codes administered by centralized authorities. The local autonomy that had allowed communities to develop specialized survival techniques was reduced as legal systems became more standardized and less responsive to local conditions. The social changes that accompanied these broader transformations were equally significant. The egalitarian social structures that had characterized many Viking communities were gradually replaced by more hierarchical systems that concentrated power and resources in the hands of fewer individuals. The community cooperation that had been essential for winter survival was more difficult to maintain in these hierarchical systems, and the social bonds that had supported knowledge preservation were gradually weakened. The cultural changes that occurred during this period were perhaps the most devastating for knowledge preservation. The cultural values that had supported winter survival, including the emphasis on practical skills, community cooperation, and adaptation to environmental challenges, were gradually replaced by different values more compatible with the emerging political and economic systems. The pride and survival capabilities that had been central to Viking identity was replaced by different sources of cultural identity that didn't support the maintenance of traditional knowledge. The psychological changes that accompanied these broader transformations were equally significant. The confidence in community survival capabilities that had sustained Viking communities through impossible challenges was gradually replaced by dependence on external authorities and systems. The psychological resilience that had been essential for winter survival was no longer cultivated or valued in the same way, and the mental frameworks that had supported survival knowledge were gradually abandoned. The educational changes that occurred during this period were particularly significant for knowledge preservation. Informal educational systems that had maintained winter survival knowledge were gradually replaced by formal educational systems that had different priorities and different approaches to knowledge transfer. The apprenticeship systems that had trained survival experts were gradually eliminated as economic and social systems changed, and the cultural practices that had supported knowledge preservation were gradually abandoned. The urbanization that began during the later medieval period also contributed to knowledge loss. As people moved from rural settlements to towns and cities, they lost direct contact with the environmental conditions that had shaped Viking winter survival techniques. The knowledge that had been essential for survival in rural settlements became irrelevant for urban populations. And the social structures that had supported knowledge preservation in small communities were difficult to maintain in larger urban environments. The technological changes that occurred during this period created both opportunities and challenges for knowledge preservation. The development of writing systems made it theoretically possible to document survival techniques in ways that had been impossible during the earlier Viking period. But the people who possessed this knowledge were often illiterate, and the people who could write often lacked the practical experience needed to accurately document survival techniques. The few attempts to preserve winter survival knowledge in written form were often incomplete or inaccurate, and they couldn't capture the social and psychological aspects of survival that were crucial for successful implementation. The military changes that occurred during the transition from the Viking Age to the later medieval period also affected knowledge preservation. The professional military systems that replaced Viking warrior bands had different training requirements and different approaches to resource management. The survival skills that had been essential for Viking warriors were often irrelevant for medieval soldiers, and the social structures that had supported these capabilities were gradually eliminated as military organization became more centralized and specialized. The demographic changes that occurred during this period were equally significant. The population growth that characterized much of the later medieval period created new pressures on resources and new approaches to community organization that were often incompatible with traditional Viking survival techniques. The smaller, more autonomous communities that had developed and maintained winter survival knowledge were gradually absorbed into larger political and economic systems that had different priorities and different approaches to resource management. The environmental changes that occurred during this period created new challenges that traditional survival techniques were undesigned to handle. The deforestation that accompanied population growth reduced the availability of fuel and building materials essential for winter survival. The soil depletion that resulted from intensive agriculture reduced the productivity of food systems that communities depended on for winter survival. The climate changes that began during the later medieval period created new weather patterns that traditional survival techniques were undesigned to handle. The trade changes that occurred during this period also affected knowledge preservation. The long-distance trading networks that had supported Viking expansion and colonization were gradually replaced by different commercial systems that had different requirements and different approaches to resource management. The knowledge that had been essential for managing resources in isolated settlements became less relevant as communities became more integrated into larger economic systems. The legal changes that occurred during the transition from the Viking Age to the later medieval period also contributed to knowledge loss. The customary legal systems that had supported Viking communities were gradually replaced by written legal codes administered by centralized authorities. The local autonomy that had allowed communities to develop specialized survival techniques was reduced as legal systems became more standardized and less responsive to local conditions. The social changes that accompanied these broader transformations were equally significant. The egalitarian social structures that had characterized many Viking communities were gradually replaced by more hierarchical systems that concentrated power and resources in the hands of fewer individuals. The community cooperation that had been essential for winter survival was more difficult to maintain in these hierarchical systems, and the social bonds that had supported knowledge preservation were gradually weakened. The cultural changes that occurred during this period were perhaps the most devastating for knowledge preservation. The cultural values that had supported winter survival, including the emphasis on practical skills, community cooperation, and adaptation to environmental challenges, were gradually replaced by different values more compatible with the emerging political and economic systems. The pride and survival capabilities that had been central to Viking identity was replaced by different sources of cultural identity that did support the maintenance of traditional knowledge. The psychological changes that accompanied these broader transformations were equally significant. The confidence in community survival capabilities that had sustained Viking communities through impossible challenges was gradually replaced by dependence on external authorities and systems. The psychological resilience that had been essential for winter survival was no longer cultivated or valued in the same way, and the mental frameworks that had supported survival knowledge were gradually abandoned. The educational changes that occurred during this period were particularly significant for knowledge preservation. Informal educational systems that had maintained winter survival knowledge were gradually replaced by formal educational systems that had different priorities and different approaches to knowledge transfer. The apprenticeship systems that had trained survival experts were gradually eliminated as economic and social systems changed, and the cultural practices that had supported knowledge preservation were gradually abandoned. The technological changes that occurred during this period created new possibilities for knowledge preservation, but they also created new challenges. The development of better construction techniques, more effective heating systems, more efficient food preservation methods made it theoretically possible to survive winter conditions with less specialized knowledge. But these technological improvements also reduced the incentive to maintain traditional survival knowledge, and the social structures that had supported knowledge preservation were gradually weakened as communities became more dependent on external technologies. The economic changes that occurred during this period were equally significant. The market-based economic systems that gradually replaced traditional resource management approaches were often more efficient for normal conditions, but they were less resilient for crisis situations. The redundant resource systems and community cooperation mechanisms that had supported winter survival were gradually eliminated as economic systems became more specialized and efficient. The political changes that occurred during this period also affected knowledge preservation. The centralized political systems that replaced Viking communities were often more effective at organizing large-scale activities and managing resources across wide areas, but they were less responsive to local conditions and less supportive of the specialized knowledge that had been essential for winter survival. The local autonomy that had allowed communities to develop and maintain survival techniques was gradually reduced as political systems became more centralized. The religious changes that occurred during this period were equally significant. The Christian religious systems that gradually replaced traditional Norse beliefs had different values and different approaches to knowledge preservation. The storytelling traditions and cultural practices that had supported winter survival knowledge were often associated with pagan beliefs that were actively suppressed, and the social structures that had maintained these traditions were gradually eliminated. The demographic changes that occurred during this period created new challenges for knowledge preservation. The population mobility that characterized the later medieval period made it more difficult to maintain the stable communities that had supported knowledge transfer. The urbanization that began during this period drew people away from the rural environments, where winter survival knowledge was most relevant, and the social structures that had supported. Knowledge preservation in small communities were difficult to maintain in larger urban environments. The environmental changes that occurred during this period created new challenges that traditional survival techniques were undesigned to handle. The climate changes that began during the later medieval period created new weather patterns that required different survival strategies. The ecological changes that resulted from human activity created new resource constraints that traditional techniques were undesigned to manage. The landscape changes that occurred as political and economic systems changed created new challenges for communities that had developed their survival techniques for different environmental conditions. The speed with which these changes occurred was remarkable and devastating for knowledge preservation. Traditional survival systems that had been developed over centuries were often eliminated in a matter of decades as communities adapted to new political, economic, and social conditions. The knowledge that had kept entire populations alive through impossible challenges was often lost, before people fully understood what they were relinquishing. The irreversible nature of this knowledge loss was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire process. Once communities lost the ability to maintain their traditional survival systems, they often found it impossible to recover these capabilities, even when they recognized their importance. The social structures, cultural practices, and psychological frameworks that had supported Viking winter survival were so complex and so interdependent that they could not be easily reconstructed once they had been abandoned. Archaeological evidence for this comprehensive system collapse is both extensive and heartbreaking. We find evidence of communities that gradually abandoned sophisticated survival techniques in favor of simpler approaches that were easier to maintain but less effective for winter survival. We see evidence of technological regression as communities lost the ability to maintain complex survival systems. We find evidence of social fragmentation as communities lost the cooperation mechanisms that had supported their survival capabilities. But perhaps most poignantly, we find evidence of communities that were clearly aware of their deteriorating survival capabilities and were making desperate attempts to preserve their knowledge even as they were collapsing. These sites show us people who understood the value of what they were losing and who made extraordinary efforts to maintain their traditional ways of life, even when they lacked the resources to do so effectively. Their failure wasn't due to ignorance or lack of effort. It was due to the overwhelming nature of the challenges they faced and the inadequacy of the support systems available to them. The legacy of this knowledge loss extends far beyond the historical period when it occurred. The winter survival techniques Vikings developed represented some of the most sophisticated approaches to extreme environment survival that humans had ever created. The loss of this knowledge eliminated capabilities that might have been crucial for later human expansion into challenging environments. The social structures and cultural practices that had supported these capabilities were also lost, eliminating models of human organization that might have been valuable for other survival challenges. The lessons from this knowledge loss process are sobering for anyone interested in human survival and adaptation. They demonstrate that even the most sophisticated survival systems can be lost with shocking rapidity when the social and cultural structures that support them are disrupted. They show that knowledge preservation requires constant effort and resources that may not be available during crisis periods. They reveal that the loss of survival capabilities can create cascading failures that are difficult to predict and impossible to reverse once they begin. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate that human survival achievements are far more fragile than they appear. The Vikings, who achieved legendary survival capabilities, did so through the development of incredibly sophisticated systems that were perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances. When those circumstances changed, the systems that had made their achievements possible were no longer viable. The capabilities that had sustained them for generations were lost forever. Understanding this fragility is crucial for anyone interested in human survival and adaptation in extreme environments. It reveals that survival capabilities aren't just technical achievements that can be preserved in books or museums. They depend on living social and cultural systems that must be actively maintained and adapted to changing circumstances. The loss of these systems represents not just the end of particular survival techniques, but the elimination of entire ways of understanding and responding to environmental challenges. The story of Viking winter survival and its ultimate loss serves as both inspiration and warning for modern humans facing their own environmental challenges. It demonstrates that humans are capable of incredible adaptation and survival under impossible conditions. But it also shows that these capabilities depend on social and cultural systems that are far more fragile than most people realize. The preservation of survival capabilities requires not just technical knowledge, but the maintenance of the social, cultural, and organizational systems that make the implementation of this knowledge possible. The Vikings achieved legendary survival capabilities through the development of incredibly sophisticated systems that were perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances. When those circumstances changed, the systems that had made their achievements possible were no longer viable, and the capabilities that had sustained them for generations were lost forever. This story reminds us that survival achievements aren't just individual accomplishments. They depend on complex social and cultural systems that must be actively maintained and protected. The implications of this story extend far beyond historical interest. As modern humans face new environmental challenges and consider expansion into extreme environments, the lessons from Viking winter survival become increasingly relevant. They remind us that survival in extreme environments requires more than just individual capability or technological innovation. It requires the development and maintenance of complex social systems that can support survival efforts across generations. The loss of Viking winter survival capabilities represents one of the great tragedies of human history. It's not just because of the communities that died, but because of the knowledge and capabilities that were lost forever. These capabilities represented centuries of accumulated human experience and innovation in extreme environment survival, and their loss eliminated resources that might have been crucial for future human survival and adaptation. The story of Viking winter survival ultimately demonstrates both the incredible potential of human adaptation and the fragility of the social systems that make this adaptation possible. It shows us that humans are capable of surviving and thriving in conditions that seem impossible. But it also reminds us that these capabilities depend on social and cultural systems that must be actively maintained and protected. The preservation of survival capabilities requires constant attention to the social and cultural conditions that support them. And the loss of these systems can eliminate survival capabilities with devastating speed. As we face our own environmental challenges and consider our own survival capabilities, the story of Viking winter survival serves as both inspiration and warning. It inspires us with proof that human adaptation to extreme challenges is possible, but it warns us that the social and cultural systems that support these capabilities are far more fragile than we might realize. The preservation of our own survival capabilities requires not just technical knowledge and individual skills, but the maintenance of the social, cultural, and organizational systems that make survival possible. The Vikings proved that winter didn't have to be a death sentence, but they also showed us that the difference between survival and extinction often comes down to social systems that can be lost in a single generation. Their story reminds us that our own survival capabilities are only as strong as the communities and cultures that support them, and that preserving these capabilities requires constant vigilance and effort. The winter may be coming for all of us, but the story of the Vikings shows us that with the right knowledge, preparation, and social systems, even the most impossible challenges can be overcome.